This is like, I don't know, a manifesto type video or something. Basically, something that I've been really attached to for a long time is this idea that art, novels, video games, whatever, entertainment, right? That art can be more than merely entertainment. Obviously, art has to be entertaining, it has to be engaging, otherwise, who's going to continue consuming it, right? So, yes, entertainment is a prerequisite to some extent for art. And it doesn't have to be, traditionally entertaining. It just has to be engaging, right? A book has to have tension. But I've always been a little bit... Well, if you go back far enough, I've always been very interested in things that are practical. So one of the cool things about, say, Dungeons & Dragons 3rd edition versus 5th edition, and especially 4th edition, is that these later editions are a little more gamey, especially 4th. Here's a very simple illustration. In 3rd edition, I'm not sure about 3.5, but in 3rd edition, you measured where your character was not by squares, but by inches. So the way that I've always played Dungeons and Dragons is usually, theater of the mind, where you imagine where your character is. But even when I do use little minis, which are usually like, coins and dice that we put on the field, I never used grids, really. I don't think... Oh, I have used, literal graph paper, but I never used grids. What we did was we literally played with a ruler. And so there was no diagonal math of, moving diagonally is 1.5 squares of your movement. You just tilt the ruler, whatever angle you want to move. That is the contrast, I think, between the sort of game that I want and the sort of, or book that I want, and the sort that I kind of occasionally see kicking around. I think it's less of types and more of a spectrum. So, the type that uses squares and, all sorts of very gamey things. Like, 4th edition, you basically had to make an MMO-style party. You needed a tank, you needed a healer, you needed a fighter, you needed somebody who was ranged. Or you were going to struggle with a lot of the pre-made campaigns. With 3rd edition, you might not believe this, we never had a healer. Nobody wanted to play healers, so we didn't have healers. And we managed fine. I didn't even have to give out that many potions, but, that's how we kind of compensated, is potions and resting. Simple. But what is the benefit of each? And how does this apply to novels? So the benefit of the old approach, the 3rd edition and probably older ones as well, was that what the game system was trying to do was model reality. Maybe not exactly, maybe not literally, but to some extent it modeled reality. This isn't reflected in all sorts of game mechanics, but hilariously enough, if you ever go from, say, 5th edition to 3rd or 3.5, you're going to notice in the book there's a lot of spears. There's like 12, 13, I don't know, there's a lot of spears. Like, there's a whole chunk of just spears. And okay, that's one thing. But then you're going to notice that some of them are identical. Like, the stats are identical, it's just a different name. And that'll make you curious. It's like, why are there 2 spears that deal 1d8 damage? Piercing, and, that's it. They both have the exact same stats. Maybe one's a little bit heavier. Here's the reason. The reason, as far as I can tell, is one of the creators, it might have been Gary Gygax himself, the original creator. One of the creators just really liked spears, and spears are a very, very popular battlefield weapon, much more popular than swords, because to put it shortly, swords are a sidearm. They go on your hip. And spears are, a full-size weapon. You typically use them with two hands. You can't put them on your hip because they're too long. So you either carry them around or you tie them up and put them on your back. And you can't easily take them off your back. That's when you take your sidearm out, right? So there were so many spears because we used a lot of spears because they were a primary weapon, whereas most swords are actually secondary weapons. They're, like I said, sidearms. They're like the medieval Renaissance era equivalent of the pistol, right? Okay, so it was modeling reality, is what I'm trying to say. Is why would you have two spears that have the exact same game mechanics? The answer is that they both exist in real life. So if you wanted to use one spear versus another, because maybe it was period appropriate in the game you're playing, or character appropriate, or you just think it looks cooler, you now have that option. Whereas in 5th edition, I was shocked. But yeah, there are no overlapping weapons. And that's great, right? It's simpler. Instead of having 2 pages of weapons that are very fine print, as in the 3rd edition books, in 5th edition you have 1 page and it's like half the page and the print is a little larger. And so that's great. There's no redundancy, but at the same time, you see how the principle is different. I'll give one last example, and that's bounded accuracy. So in 3rd edition, you would stack bonuses. Or you could, and smart players would. So a quick example, something my players always tried to do was to get flanking bonus. So if you have one person on either side of an enemy, you get an advantage, like a bonus to how easy it is to hit them, because they kind of have to deal with more. Another thing is, if you charge at somebody, then you get an advantage to hit and a disadvantage to getting hit because you're being a little reckless, right? So even just thinking about what your character is trying to do and then how that would practically play out just using your intuition, everything matches up. And so these bonuses would stack. And so one of the things, people, I don't know if they complained about it, but one of the things you would do in 3rd edition is you would get all sorts of these criteria to get bonus upon bonus upon bonus upon bonus. So if you're charging into somebody and you have a friend on the other side, then you're going to get the bonus from charging and the bonus from flanking. Cool. 5th edition introduced a principle, not really a mechanic, but a principle called bounded accuracy. And this was great for people who were tired of trying to keep up with all these bonuses, and maybe game masters who were tired of having to deal with somebody who stacked like 5 bonuses and suddenly they, for one attack anyway, they're way more powerful than they should be. I love when the Xbox randomly turns on. Definitely not creepy. So what they did instead, right, this bounded accuracy, is instead of getting a bonus, you would get something called advantage. And so what that means is you roll 2 dice and you get to keep the higher one rather than the lower one. And disadvantage is the opposite. You keep the lower one and just set aside the other one. Very interesting mechanic. It's a lot of fun. It feels satisfying for players. However, notice, you can never go above that 20. Whereas in 3rd edition, the bonuses were +2. So you get +2, +2, so that's 4, 6, 8, depending on how much stuff you're stacking. You could just go off, find as much practical advantage as you can. And think about it. Let's tie it back to reality. If you have, in real life, somebody, imagine a fight. And it's a fantasy fight, so we'll give or take a few things, but it's a semi-realistic fantasy fight. And you have somebody who is currently in combat with a bad guy, and his friend on the other side charges into battle with his spear. Is the enemy now easier to hit because of the charge? Sure. Or whatever bonus it was that charging gave you. But if you're charging into an enemy that is currently in combat with your comrade, are they also easier to hit? Yes. And do these bonuses stack practically? Yes. Just imagine you're the enemy. You're currently fighting somebody, and then somebody behind you comes in and charges you. You have to deal with the fact that this person is running. And you also have to deal with the fact that you're currently in a melee with somebody else. That's a double disadvantage. So, in 3rd edition, that would be reflected. +2/+2. The charging person gets +2 from charging and +2 from the fact that the enemy's in combat. How does it work in 5th edition? Well, I'm pretty sure they removed charging. But I know for a fact that they removed flanking because my party flanked like mad. We had a party full of, we didn't have healers. We didn't even have casters. Okay, we had a party full of people who just wanted to smack people with a sword. And so flanking, we used it a ton. And it's not in 5th edition. But pretend it was. Pretend that both of these mechanics were in 5th edition. You'd get advantage because you're attacking somebody who's already in combat. And you'd get advantage because you're charging. But that doesn't matter to 5th edition because you can only get one instance of advantage. It's binary. It's not additive like the bonuses. You either have advantage or you don't. So, all that to say, 5th edition and other sorts of approaches to both games and art in general are pleasing on a practical level within their own contained system. 5th edition was a joy to run. It's what I ran most of my dungeon mastering career in high school, mostly. 3rd edition was more complicated. It had random bonuses that you could get from nowhere because they were situationally relevant. They were practical, intuitive. It made sense, not because it makes sense within the context of a game system, but because it makes sense in regards to reality. And because there was a practical reality that the game system was trying to model, rather than a game system on its own, kind of disconnected from reality, just trying to be fun, which is fine. But it's not what I'm going for. I'm going for that weird 3rd edition where you can stack bonuses because sometimes you just have bonus upon bonus. I like the 3rd edition where, why are there 3 spears that have the same stats? Well, because a glaive is different from a halberd. Functionally, they're very similar. Not really, but I'm just using those as an example. But functionally, certain spears are very similar. But, maybe one was used in the East and one was used in the West. And so there's cultural relevance that has nothing to do with mechanics. And that's interesting. That's still valid. That's still, even if the mechanics are identical, that still is sufficient reason for there to be a second spear with the same mechanics, but a different name and design. In 3rd edition. In a game system that's trying to some extent, and maybe in a simplified manner, model reality. 5th edition was trying to be, I guess, easy to play, and they were trying to get rid of things that they saw as issues. What was difficult is that the classic issue of Dungeons and Dragons 3rd edition, Pathfinder did not fix it because it's so fundamental, is that mages level up exponentially, like their power, you could say damage output, goes up exponentially, whereas fighters go up linearly. Fighters just get more damage, whereas mages get not only more damage, but more spells, and their spells do more damage based on level. So, like, they have all sorts of different uses. Like, a mage could cast, like, a silence spell and then sneak just as good as the thief, even though he has no thief training, no, rogue training. So, this imbalance, it's better in 5th, but mages still have way more options. Now, fighters are super duper cool in 5th. They're way cooler in 5th than they are in 3rd. I'll grant that. However, basically getting an extra turn at high levels doesn't really make up for what mages have, but it's a lot better. But the point is, they fixed some things by introducing this bounded accuracy. It was way easier to balance 5th edition. There isn't weird, crazy stuff happening. There isn't, including things like stacking 5 bonuses so you have a plus 10 to hit, and you start beating things you're not supposed to. But I think that's almost the point. Is in 3rd edition, you can do stuff that you don't think you're supposed to. Because how it works, well, let's compare. In 5th edition, it's like, okay, what are my abilities? What are my skills? What can I do in this situation according to the system? And again, I'm exaggerating to make a point. This isn't exactly how it works. But then you compare that to 3rd edition, where it's like, okay, if I were in this situation, this medieval type world, what could I plausibly try to do? And then you try and do it, and either you or hopefully the game master says, okay, here are the mechanics we'll use to process that attempt. And so really, this is also true to 5th edition, but it's different because of everything I just talked about. Because of things like bonus stacking, because there's so many examples. There are just random mechanics in 3rd edition that apply only in certain situations. Why? Not because it makes the system more overall cohesive and easy to manage and understand, but because sometimes that situation happens, and here's how you process it in this framework. I don't know if you can hear that, but that's the washing machine. All right, we got our white noise back. So I'm gonna try and start closing things off here. Hopefully, I didn't get too technical and gamey for everybody. And if I did, I explained it enough that it makes some sense. And I think these examples are pretty useful. So that is one of the goals that we will be striving towards. I will be striving towards anyway, in the creation of my own systems. That it will attempt to model reality, even if it's at the expense of the system's overall cohesion and consistency. Because, contrary to what physicists would hope, reality is not always consistent and cohesive. Just ask a black hole. And I think that is actually a good summary, where 5th edition is very consistent, very cohesive. Once you know the core system, you don't have to go digging around for random mechanics for certain situations. Like, there's a rule, I don't know if it's a variant, but the one rule you'll find in the Dungeon Master's Guide is the instant death rule. If a player takes more than 50 damage in one attack, they just die. I think 90% of Dungeons and Dragons players didn't even know that was a mechanic. I think it's an optional mechanic, but it does exist. So, alright, that was getting excessively loud, so we're going to finish up here in the studio. Basically, how does this apply to things like novels? Well, I think instead of game mechanics, what you have in literature is the structure, the story structure. So, everyone and their mom, a lot of people have heard of the hero's journey, which is a way of planning or analyzing a story. And, they say, oh, this is the monomyth, all the stories use this, great. Romeo and Juliet is not a monomyth, right? They don't leave their city. The whole thing takes place in their hometown, which leaving your city is step one of the monomyth. They don't really have a mentor. They have a helpful character in the I think it's a priest or pastor, the religious dude who is interested in helping them elope. He officiates their secret marriage, or it is meant to. But there you go. You have structures like the monomyth, the 3-act structure, the 5-act structure, the 27-chapter structure. And what can happen is that sometimes you start to feel this, like, those are useful, and people who want to use them, go ahead and use them. Hollywood uses it all the time. I think every other Marvel movie is a monomyth. But I try to avoid them to some extent. Not completely. I'm not trying to go make up my own literary structured genre or anything like this. But I would rather plan using a summary than plan using anything like this, any of these systems. Some better lighting here. It's a little strange, but we'll run with it. So, I think I'm running out of steam, but let's just briefly apply this to novels. What I like to call the horror movie effect is the result of relying too heavily and too strictly on these structures, such that the audience actually starts to notice that things are being forced here, or there's too much plot convenience. I love that term, plot convenience, because that was something I've been working out of my novel for all over the place. Anytime I see it, I try and look, okay, can I make this a little less convenient and more practical, more realistic? And usually I actually find a way, which is awesome. Sometimes it means I have to move characters around, but everything ends up coming out more natural and better in my opinion. So, how is this similar to what I was just talking about with game systems? And the answer is basically the planning template or outline that you're using functions very similar to the game system. And so there are two sorts of approaches when you're planning a book. One of them is the prescriptive type, where it's like, here are your 27 chapters, fill in the blanks, and there's your story. This definitely works fine for people, and it also helps you push out massive amounts of books because you don't have to think about the structure. I'm not saying you don't have to think about the story or the book or anything like that. I'm not even saying it's lazy. What I'm saying is you just literally don't have to think about the structure, and so you can. It could probably almost be liberating, where you can just focus on the story and know that the structure is going to take care of things like the climax and the inciting incident and the denouement and all these other things. But the downside is the horror movie effect, which is, to explain it, basically, in horror movies where they say, like, well, where you're watching and you see the characters about to go into the dark and scary room in the house that has no power, and it's like, don't go in the dark and scary room, not until you have a flashlight or a torch or or bonfire, um, and then they go into the dark and scary room and get attacked by the monster, obviously. So that is the sort of thing that I want to avoid, which is basically when you can see the fingers of the author or the hard edges of the template or structure in the story. And so you get things like characters doing things out of character or being a little too stupid to further the plot. Things like plot convenience, where I don't know, the character doesn't have a weapon and he's got to fight the bad guy. And fortunately, in the garbage bin is a special magic sword. It's just like, how did that? Unless you had a chapter, a few hundred pages back where there's this whole weird scene about a bandit who stole a sword and is running away and it's too heavy, so he just throws it in the garbage and then he gets away. And then later you see this plot thread picked up by the main narrative when the main character goes, why is there a sword here? Whatever, let me fight the bad guy. That is actually cleaning up plot convenience. That makes it seem more natural. And so one of the things you can do is sort of foreshadow certain things. Great. So I'll talk about this sort of thing later because I've been fighting with it since November. So November, December, +4, 6, half a year basically. Half a year basically, where obviously just writing without a plan is a great way to avoid this, but what ends up happening is actually frequently, because these structures are they're kind of like low-hanging fruit. They have a certain logic to them, and so we naturally end up writing certain stories like the monomyth. I'll give you an example in the monomyth. So step one, depending on who's making the list of steps, is they leave their hometown. Maybe they were exiled. Step two is they find a mentor. Maybe that's step three, but the point is it's one of the next steps. And then later they go to the underworld, and then finally they slay the monster. They find the treasure, and then they bring the treasure back to their village. Let's do a brief analysis of this. If you want to go on an adventure, and you are in your hometown, how do you go on an adventure? Unless there's something really cool happening in your town, right? Like a murder mystery. You have to leave the town. So you see what I mean? It's just like, oh, obviously. Okay, then you go into the big world and you're not prepared because you've only been living in a town, or maybe you're young, or both. You need to learn from somebody. It just follows. The only ways I can think of off the top of my head to escape this is the character learns from a book, or they go to some sort of school, which usually has teachers, which then fall into the mentor category, or they're just already awesome, which can totally work. James Bond is just awesome the entire time, right? Superman is in the old ones. He just showed up, saved the day, and went home. Like that was it. There's no training sequence for Superman. He's just great to start. So and that that can totally work. These are two very successful franchises, I guess you could call them, but it's not. Sorry, it is natural to have your character learn from somebody, right? And I was actually talking to a friend of mine about something similar, where basically, like, there are certain shows, anime really, where there are a lot of older characters who mentor the younger characters. The very famous My Hero Academia. Apparently, I haven't watched it, but apparently Naruto is the same way. And from the little I know of it, that seems to check out. Why? Why is this so powerful? I think the answer is because, like, apprenticeship and learning from somebody more skilled in, like, your tribe goes back millennia, probably. And even that aside, the sort of parent-child relationship is basically being modeled by the mentor to some extent. So it's not only natural, like, it's not only logical that obviously they need to learn, but it's also it resonates because everybody has parents. Nearly everybody has gone to school, and if they haven't, we should find a charity that's addressing that and go donate. So where I'm going with this, there we go, I remember now, is if you're writing from the top of your head, if you're writing into the dark, if you're pantsing, if you're a discovery writer, if you're a gardener writer, where you plant seeds and watch it grow naturally, right? That's what the author of Game of Thrones, Martin, George Martin, I think, um, calls his method, which explains why it's so hard for him to finish his books, because he doesn't know where they're going to some extent. It wasn't like J.K. Rowling, who, like, templated out all of her books, famously on a napkin or a scrap paper or whatever. Regardless, all right, let us finish the point. If you're just writing from the top of your head, you're going to fall into these things that resonate if you're a good writer, especially. Like the mentor relationship, like the leaving your town and going into the big world um, trope, or whatever archetype. Who cares? So the word you want to use. Um, you're going to fall into that stuff naturally. So here's a fascinating example, and it's relevant to my current endeavors with my business. Well, it's trying to be a business. I think I really liked Alex Hormozzi's statement. I think it was him who said, like, if you own a business, which I do, but it's not making any income, you don't really have a business, right? You just have an LLC, and that's where we are right now. Haven't made any money, but regardless, you're going to naturally write this. you're going to naturally fall into some sort of category. And if you go into things like there are 7 plots and all this, okay, I don't have the book here. But Northrop Frye's Anatomy of Criticism, it is literary criticism or, story analysis from one of the greatest minds in the topic of the last century, Dr. Northrop Frye. He passed away maybe a decade ago, maybe 2 decades ago. But I knew a professor who learned from this man. So I actually have like 2 degrees of separation from him. That's cool. But in this book, he lays out 4 or 5 main myths, or as we would say in common vernacular, genres. And it turns out, my first ever book, I wrote it off the top of my head. I wrote a chapter a day, more or less. I took a few days off, like 1 or 2 days off a week. And I ended up falling into one of those categories. And what was really cool is that I didn't follow it to a T. So what I was able to do later was then, and I wrote an entire essay about this. Maybe I will link it in the description. But maybe not, because it spoils the entire book. But yeah, if you go to my website, danieltriumph.com or .ca, depending on whether or not I've moved the site, and you search Alison Finch archetypal recapitulation, you will find that essay. Okay. So, the 4 myths are, I'm not going to use his terms because his terms don't match up with what's conventional. I'll use more conventional terms. So they're the sort of, the story with the happy ending, where the community gets together at the end. He calls that a comedy, and historically speaking, that was a comedy. It didn't have to be funny. It just had to be a story where the main character is reintegrated into society at the end, and kind of everybody wins. If you've ever seen a movie, maybe a kid's movie, where there's a big party at the end, and even some of the bad guys go, they weren't so bad after all, and they show up to the party too. Yeah, that was probably a comedy. A great example. Well, it's not a great example. I don't think the movie has very good ratings, but regardless of the quality of the movie, it is a good example of a comic ending. Was Ella Enchanted? It was a movie I watched in theaters when I was like a kid. And so at the end of that movie, there's a big song and dance. And in other situations, the big party is a wedding. Because usually comedies have 2 main characters, a male and a female, who get together at the end. And so we see my book, Alison Finch, was a comedy where 2 lovers are separated by some sort of intervening force. Archetypally, it's the father. In my story, it wasn't. It was, well, it sort of was, but the major force that drove them apart was actually the fact that she got exiled. The girl gets exiled, Alice gets exiled, and so the institution that exiled her was the guards, basically the police, and so they were really the major blocking force. And so, yeah, in every comedy, there's a blocking force that separates the lovers. And then they spend the whole story trying to get back together. And when they get back together, there's a party or a wedding. That's what happened in my book. I didn't read this yet. It just happened. I just wrote it, and it made sense. Because if you separate the lovers, obviously you've got to bring them back by the end. Unless you're writing a tragedy or an irony. But I wasn't. So it happened naturally. Was there a wedding at the end? No. But there was a sort of weird party where all the kids who grew up together got back together and destroyed a temple. So there are some stark deviations from the genre, and I think that I love being different. I would totally love to try and fight my way through the 4 genres or 5 genres, depending on which model you're taking from this book, and make up my own 5th genre, or maybe even 6th or 7th. But I'm also happy seeing what happened naturally. See, it happened naturally. I didn't impose a template. So I'm almost equally as happy, maybe even more happy, because I can actually compare and contrast versus the sort of generic tropes. I mean generic technically, like as in the genre tropes, the generic tropes, right? So I was able to literally use this book. Actually, it was a handout that was printed off from a professor. There was a scan of this book. And I went, oh, I do have blocking characters. Oh, I do have helping characters. And you see how these categories are huge, but they have a specific role. Obviously, blocking characters are anything that blocks the lovers from getting together. Okay. That's a huge category, but it has a specific narrative function. If the person is annoying and mean and villainous, but they don't separate the lovers, then they're not a blocking character. They're just troublesome. And helpful characters. They support the lovers. What's interesting is that I had a character who was, you could say a trickster, but she was both. She was helpful, and also she was like a possible alternate love interest. And so basically, if the main character, or if the male main character fell for her, that would be tragic. That would be a complete derail of the story. But she's actually actively helping them reunite. So there's a weird tension with this character, and I was like, that's interesting. That's kind of unique. And I wouldn't have known that it was unique if I didn't look at this book. And so I recommend this. Actually, it's hard to recommend this because this is an academic book written by a PhD for other PhDs. When I learned this in university, we read one section, but I had a professor. The professor actually learned from him directly. He had handouts, like a 4-page handout that summarized the major themes from this book. And so I'll be honest, I haven't read it. I've read that far. You can see my tabs. About 60 pages. But I know the gist. I know the important parts, and I know the comedy section because I got it in a handout. And to bring this back to the point, because I approached it from a natural or practical perspective, rather than looking at the comic story arc where lovers get separated and then by blocking characters, then they reunite with the help of helpful characters, and then at the end there's a big celebration. Rather than taking this structure and then imposing it to write a new story, I just wrote the story from my heart, more or less, and it naturally turned out that way, but with some cool, interesting tweaks, kind of major differences, where the blocking character wasn't necessarily one character, it was an entire institution or an entire town that she got exiled from, which is a much bigger thing for the other character to overcome. And that we had a character who was both helpful and sort of blocking, like sort of troublesome. Very interesting. Would I have thought of that? Either of those, and more. There's more stuff. The essay I wrote on this was like 4 or 5 pages. Would I have managed? Would I have thought of these things if I started with the template? If I knew this stuff from the start? Because I didn't learn it until I didn't learn the comic part until a year or two later. And then I was like, wait a second. I wrote what I'm reading about. And then I wrote the essay. So the template or the outline, the monomyth, or the comic arc, whatever you want to call it, is functionally the same, more or less, as the game system that is more concerned about its internal cohesiveness and its internal workings than it is with actually modeling reality. And that is, not that it doesn't model reality, but if it has to forsake an element of reality or practicality or intuition in order to make the system run better, it will do that. Versus this other approach, this third edition approach, where you have random mechanics for specific situations, because sometimes things work a certain way. Like in physics, we have a formula for the acceleration due to gravity, we have formulas for like force and work, and momentum, and that's all cohesive. And then, if you're using a spring, there's a spring formula, just on its own. So sometimes that's just how things work. You just have something that, in this case, you use this formula, but in every other case, you use these ones. Just because springs are different. And so third edition does that, and then writing from the top of your head, or a different method, a way of planning that allows you to get a good picture, a very clean, cohesive picture of your novel, and fix things like plot conveniences, which I told you about earlier, and also told you that I resolved earlier. And then we also resolved the example with the sword and finding a sword in the garbage can. You can fix that stuff much easier if you have a plan, rather than trying to sift through hundreds of pages of prose to find all the points that you need to fix. And so I will not talk about this sort of thing in this video, but basically I have been crafting a method for planning a book that doesn't ignore structure, but does not require a structure or template, like the hero's journey, like the comic arc, like the tragic arc, like, are there other famous ones? Well, there's a few. Like, the 3-act structure, or the 27-chapter outline. You can use those or reference those or be aware of those, but then you plan in a more free-form way. And then what you can do after, if you want, is you can then reference it on the, say, 5-act structure and say, oh, the first act is built up, the second act happens after a turning point, or the catalyst, or the inciting incident, or whatever. And then by the 4th act, we have a climax, and then the 5th act is the denouement, the sort of cleanup, or what I call the relief, or epilogues. And you can take that and be like, okay, where are my acts? Similar to how I found out that all my stuff is in the comic arc, or the comic myth. And then I looked, okay, where does that apply in my book? You can do the same. You can be like, oh yeah, chapters 1 through 5 is Act 1. And then there's the big catalyst. Okay, so chapters, what did I say, 1 through 5? So 6 through 12 is the catalyst, and the catalyst unraveling the main character's life. And so on, and so forth. Act 3 would probably be rising action, 4 is the climax, and 5 is the wind down. And the wind down is important, by the way, anybody who's a writer, because it gives the reader their last impression, and that really does a lot for whether or not they buy your next book or check out your backlog to buy a previous book. So making a satisfying ending, even if it's not a happy ending, making a satisfying ending, and that might mean, it's not a happy ending, but it makes them think, there's still some satisfaction there, and it lingers in their mind, and bam, sales. So that's all I'm going to talk about today. This was supposed to be a 12-minute thing. It is not. I will publish this. I was going to publish this just on my personal channel, but I think it's actually beneficial enough that I'm going to put it out on the the uh, the charts channel, the Chochma Arts channel. So, with that being said, check out links in the description. We should have the company website down there eventually. I'm working on it. I'll put my personal website where you can look for the essay if you're interested. I have all sorts of free stories on there so you can see if I actually am as good a writer as I seem. um, and, like the video if you liked it. If you made it this far, probably you liked it. Go ahead and hit that button for the algorithm.